So welcome back, everyone. And we are in the course on beginning of human life bioethics within the program of the Masters of Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Beginning always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for your many blessings amidst the difficulties of our lives and the world today, that you have kept us alive up until now. We continue to pray for those who are in most need of your mercy, and we ask your inspiration always to delve deeply into the truth about these bioethical issues at the beginning and at the end of human life, so that we may also help others in understanding the truth and living according to the truth in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Spirit. So today we're going to look at two aspects moving forward with the issues on bioethics at the beginning of life. The ontological status of the human embryo, and then the controversial topic of abortion, which is obviously one of the big topics in bioethics at the beginning of life, human life. So just any questions or comments before going forward? Okay, I've done a lot of biology so far with regards to genetics, fertilization, and early embryonic development to understand in detail this mechanical, physical, chemical process of fertilization and essentially generating an offspring of the same species going forward into the next generation. Okay, so any animal or plant that reproduces sexually essentially goes through the same basic principles, the same fundamental pathways, if you will, in nature. First, since fertilization involves the fusion of gametes, right, which are haploid, then those cells have to be generated first, and they're generated through the process of either oogenesis or spermatogenesis, depending on the male or the female of the species, and then continuing with the process of fertilization itself. The fertilization, keep in mind, may either be internal or external, all right? In fact, most species have external fertilization. For example, plants don't copulate, right? And so they have external fertilization. The pollen of the male has to travel to the pistil, to the ovary of the female, wherever it is, in the same flower or in another flower, or in the case of pine trees, in the pine cones. And for animals, again, most animals have external fertilization also. They lay the eggs out in nature, typically in water or some humid environment. The female does that, of course, and then the male lays out the sperm somewhere nearby, hopefully, and then the sperm will have to swim around and wiggle and fertilize those eggs. But mammals and also reptiles and birds, right, are the three classes of animals that have internal fertilization in addition to the fertilization process itself. Okay, and that's to give an extra layer of protection to the embryo. And then of those three groups, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, only one group, only one class has actually internal gestation. So we have like two layers, if you will, of protection. The first layer is internal fertilization. It guarantees greater success of fertilization when it's internal, right? And secondly is internal gestation, in other words, the pregnancy. So consider for a moment with our mind's eye, a reptile or a bird, what are they going to, they have internal fertilization. In other words, there is copulation, there is mating, but then what is produced? What does the female produce? Literally an egg, an encased egg with a shell that is either hard, like in the case of birds, or soft in case of reptiles, but it's an actual encased egg. So the embryo literally is encased and then is thrown out into the environment where there is greater risk, okay? And so there's no internal gestation. Gestation is a reference to pregnancy. Only mammals have developed this second layer of protection precisely for the embryo, okay? And internal gestation, which means that in nature, once that embryo is born, when that fetus is born, right, it should be ready to survive more or less. And so when you think about mammals, which are typically quadrupeds, right, they have 4 legs, that mammal, that embryo, that fetus, the baby, the offspring, when he or she is born, has to be ready to run. Newborn giraffe has to run because what's behind the mother giraffe that's giving birth? The lion, okay, or the cheetah, or the hyena. And so these, sometimes they're literally born running. The mother, the pregnant mom, is actually running and gives birth and keeps running. And so it's very precarious out there. But then we humans, because we got civilized somehow, give birth prematurely. It's estimated that really we could take about 3 more months in the womb for the development of the brain especially. And some of the other major organs a little bit also could take a little bit more development, but especially the brain is really born prematurely. So we could take about 3 more months, but then what will happen is, because what's the problem? It's the size problem of the embryo and the and the girdle, what's it called, the pelvic girdle of the woman, right? That could not be too large to pass the head of the baby, because then she would basically be humongous. She would have a huge hip, not just from fat, but from the actual bone structure. And I guess it got selected out in evolution early on when we were still running, when primitive humans, as we did that phylogenetics last semester, right? In our primitive state of cave men and women, we were still running from prey, right? We were still subject to predation. And so that hip was, if it got larger, it was selected out. So those older embryos, older fetuses, which were who were carrying the genes for a longer gestation, got selected out. I mean, it's a speculation, but it's a plausibility. At any rate, the baby is born prematurely, but again, thanks to civilization and protection, and especially the earliest protection that we got was what? Harnessing fire, right? We use fire as a defense. Out in a primitive state, we can keep the lions away, and so then the mothers could nurture the babies, could lactate the babies through that weak stage into toddlers and so forth when they become a little stronger. But all this to point out that gestation really for mammals and particularly for humans is a very, very special time of protection. And I mentioned that we grow about 5,000 times, right? Of course, this diagram here, is this to scale? This is obviously not to scale, because if this were the size of a human zygote compared to a human baby, you know, that the baby, let's say, is a foot long, 12 inches. This zygote is about 1/4. This zygote would be about 4 inches long, right? So it's not to scale. You follow? It's not to scale. When we look at diagrams, a little aside, it's important to realize, because we kind of take it for granted, but diagrams many times are not drawn to scale, precisely to highlight something. Because if we were to draw this zygote to scale of the baby here, the zygote would just be a little dot, right? And we couldn't see that it has a diploid nucleus, that it has a fused nucleus of egg and sperm, the two pronuclei. And then from the zygote forward, it's all mitosis. Mitosis, doubling of the cell number, which you realize mathematically gets to a geometric progression, and a geometric progression is a very fast way of duplicating the number. Okay, so very quickly, relatively speaking, this embryo grows in size, in cellular mass, which is what's needed. Then at the blastocyst stage, we have the first level of cellular differentiation, and then it continues into the gastrula, where we get the 3 germ layers, and then eventually all the organs and tissues. At the 8th week, which is represented here more or less, between the 8th and the 9th week, all the major organs in place, but again, tiny, miniature. And then it's mostly a growth in size, but also further specialization and getting down to the details. For example, for the hand bud, it's called a bud, B-U-D. The hand bud eventually has to digitalize, right? So there's the cells start giving way in the middle of the fingers, and they undergo a process of digitalization. That bud, which originally was just like a little paddle, if you will. That's externally, but internally also the bones are forming the articulation of the various bones, okay, and so forth. So there's greater detail going on, cellular specialization and differentiation until the baby is born. But certainly the baby is born totally vulnerable and defenseless, right? So the baby can still not survive on his own or her own. So whereas I'm making a point of this because there's a level of dependency here that is a great level. It's a huge level of dependency still, normally on the mother at least, and typically father also, at least to provide nourishment for the mother while the mother can stay at home or in the cave to raise the child. Okay. So the fact that the baby is born doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that newborn is independent. Okay. It's just one more stage of development. And in fact, that development will continue years and years and decades. For the brain specifically, 2 decades more, right? Okay. So here's a little summary. Then regarding fertilization and embryonic development, the logical conclusion is that life begins at fertilization because it's when we have a new individual. The egg and the sperm are not individuals, they are extensions of the father or the mother. They're tissue of the father or the mother, or they're cells of the father and the mother, okay? But the zygote, because of the genetic recombination of 50-50, it's neither all mother, neither all father. It's really a new individual, and it's alive, so it's a living individual, and that is logically the first stage of this new individual. So the bottom line is that we can conclude that life begins at fertilization, and this is a universal process for all species that reproduce sexually, including plants, all right, including plants. Then there's a continuous development of tissues and organs and so forth. 9 months, the birth comes up, and then after birth, that development continues, perhaps a little more sophisticated, internal, and there is even growth in size, on average, about 5 to 6 more times the original size of birth into adulthood. And keep in mind that adulthood biologically is defined by functional reproductive organs. So basically that means puberty, when humans hit puberty for women, when they have their first menstruation, meaning that they have their first ovulation. For men, when we have our first ejaculation, then that means that biologically we are adults. We're capable of reproducing, even though chronologically we may be teenagers, and psychologically may be even toddlers, okay? So different levels there. However, biologically, we are, when the reproductive organs are functional, then that is biological adulthood. Now, given this, we have to go back and forth here in bioethics between the biology, the philosophy, and the theology in order to do the bioethical analysis, right? And if we're going to hold that life begins at fertilization, and so the zygote is the first stage of a new individual of whatever species, including the human, we have to answer certain questions that are regarding the status of the human embryo. These are ontological questions. Ontos, again, is a reference to the being itself, all right? Ontological questions of the status of the human embryo if we're going to hold that life begins at fertilization with a zygote, that the zygote is a new individual. And specifically, these are three questions, three ontological questions with regards to the status of the human embryo. Is the human embryo, the human zygote, is the human zygote an individual? And is the zygote a human being? And is the zygote a human person? Okay, and these are three distinct questions that we need to solve, because I can tell you, having been involved in the pro-life movement for close to 50 years now, essentially since 1973, a little personal anecdote, considering that we are at the end of January and the March for Life just happened yesterday virtually in Washington, DC, for 48 years straight since Roe versus Wade, Roe v. Wade, which we'll talk about in the second half of the lecture today. 1973, I was graduating in biology from FIU, just as a young lad, not even thinking about the priesthood, okay? My goal in life when I was 20, 21, 22 is to be a marine biologist. I just wanted to be another Jacques Cousteau and travel the world and dive in the morning and sail in the afternoon and party at night. That was my plan. So I had no vision of the priesthood at that time in my plan. And yet, 1973, this law, or this through the Supreme Court of the United States, basically essentially legislating way beyond the reach that abortion was legal in all 50 countries, all 50 states, up until the time of birth, okay? All 9 months. It blew me away. I said, how can this be just what I've been learning for 4 years in secular universities? Because first I did MDC, I did Miami-Dade College for a year and a half actually, and then went into FIU for 2 years. FIU had just started in 72. These are secular institutions just on the biology that I had been learning, on embryology that I had been learning. How can it be that all of a sudden now it's legal to kill the unborn with impunity? It blew me away. So that's when I became involved in pro-life. I said, these people are just confused. They don't know. They don't know the biology. For almost 50 years, I tell you, I've been involved in that movement of pro-life. You know, to this day is also one of the motivations for generating this master's in bioethics 5 years ago, to try to teach at least some people who are interested in the facts and the analysis that we can do based on the facts. But over the years, these issues of the status of the human embryo keep coming up generation after generation. Also because, think about it, no baby is born wise, no baby is born intelligent, okay? We have a capacity, we have the potential for developing intelligence and learning, but we're not born with a language, nothing. We're born like little animals. In fact, there's something called feral animals, feral humans, F-E, I think it's R-A-L, feral. These are humans who, for some reason, escaped when they were little toddlers or got lost, or their parents lost them actually in some forest, some jungle, and they managed to survive. And sometimes some mammals actually raised them. That's the, for example, that's the myth of the foundation of ancient Rome, 8 centuries before the time of Christ, with Romulo and Remus, these two brothers who were left out in the woods, and the female wolf raised them, the she-wolf. And so you see the symbol of Rome, of the city of Rome, is a she-wolf with two little babies suckling on her. Those are Romulo and Remus, who are supposed to be the founders of the Roman Empire. Anyway, these children, when they grow up, they're basically like animals. They can walk in two legs, but that's about it. For the rest, they growl, they grunt, and they hunt, and they don't know how to speak, and they don't really know how to reason much, because language has a lot to do with developing reasoning, okay? So bottom line, we need to learn. We need to learn, and we need to learn. Someone needs to teach us. So this issue, is the human embryo an individual? Is the human embryo a human being? And is the human embryo a human person? Okay? Because, for example, with the issue of twinning, homozygotic twinning, monozygotic twinning, from one embryo, we get two embryos. So can we say that the zygote is really an individual? Well, we can get two individuals out of that one zygote, right? What's going on? Okay, so we have to address these issues. Now, let me see something here. Right, this slide is out of sequence, the Prosopon. Yeah. Okay, so I'll come to this Prosopon slide later. Basically, we're going to address first the issue of individual in view of the fact, the biological fact of twinning. And not only twinning, but an even more challenging process, which is called twin reabsorption. Okay, twin reabsorption. So let's look at this. From the theological perspective, we can frame the question in this sense. When does ensoulment happen? When does ensoulment happen? And we have two options, two possibilities, applying philosophy and logic. It's either immediate ensoulment or delayed ensoulment, which is also known as mediate, not immediate, but mediate ensoulment, okay? So immediate ensoulment would be at fertilization, whereas delayed ensoulment would be after fertilization. Remember, I'm going to draw a little bit from when we talked about the phylogenetics of the human species, the origin of our species as a whole. And based on the fossil record, we noticed that there were transitions of various other species that are now extinct, and we share the same genus, right, Homo. And at some point, there was the human form that developed, the human form capable of receiving a human soul, all right? So that is the ensoulment of the species as whole. Biblically, we call them Adam and Eve. Biologically, we call them mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam. At any rate, at some point, some individuals evolve enough, some Homo evolved enough to receive an actual human soul, which is given by God because he's the only one who has the power to generate a soul. My parents gave me the DNA, but as much as they tried, they couldn't give me a soul. All right, so the ensoulment is truly what makes us human at the theological level, and distinctly human as God's image, again, drawing from Genesis 1 and 2. And so we have these two possibilities, either immediate at the time of fertilization or mediate or delayed sometime after fertilization, okay? So here from straight up theology are some characteristics of the human soul. We also call the soul the spirit, the conscience, and this course is not going to prove the existence of the soul because it's beyond the scope of bioethics as such, but if some people prefer the term conscience, right, then that would do. But basically, it is individual. The soul is individual. In other words, it's personal. We each have a soul. It is simple in the sense that it is indivisible. Unlike the body that is divisible, literally, you know, we're made up of parts. arms, feet, legs, organs, tissues, etc., down to the molecular level, the soul is indivisible. It is simple, all right, philosophically speaking. And also eternal in the sense that it has an origin, namely at fertilization, but it has no end. In other words, it has been designed by God to live eternally, okay? Hopefully in God's glory for all eternity in the communion of angels and saints. So these are at least three basic characteristics of human soul, and they are also universal in that they apply to all human souls, all human beings, at every stage of development, anywhere in the world, from the beginning, from mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam, all right? The second philosophical conclusion is that there is a substantial unity between body and soul. So we have to really discard a dualistic view of the body and soul. A dualistic view would be thinking that, okay, so here's my body, and then I have a soul similar to pouring water inside a glass. And I can have a glass with or without water. So I can have a body with or without soul. No, that would be a contradiction of terms, really. We are substantially body and soul one. So it's a substantial unity. And this is even pre-Christian. This goes back to classical Greece as defining the human being as a rational being of substantial unity, okay? And therefore, we are body and soul one in the phrase of John Paul II, which he repeated many, many times over the decades as he traveled throughout the world, that we are body and soul one. There's a substantial unity between body and soul. Then, of course, the big mystery becomes this death, where the body and soul physically, literally separate, because the body stays here and, in fact, degrades and corrupts, whereas the soul goes on into eternal life. But that mystery of death is resolved, again, with the belief in the second coming of the Lord, the final judgment, and the reunification of our body with our soul in a glorified body, what we call glorified body, at the resurrection of the dead, which we profess in the Creed. You know, every Sunday, we see at the end of the Creed, the last concept there, the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. So there's a reunification there of body and soul at the end of all time into eternity. And so that kind of takes care of the mystery of the temporary separation of body and soul until the second coming anytime now. All right. Okay, so that's as far as the theological aspect of it. More to the point is to emphasize the substantial unity with the body and soul, and that substantial unity has to be from the beginning, so that at no time in our development, individually or phylogenetically, do we have a soulless body, all right? A soulless body, because then that body would not be human or fully human, right? All right, so these are two challenges then if we're going to hold for immediate ensoulment as opposed to the late ensoulment. Briefly, here's the challenge with the late ensoulment, and just mention it briefly because it's fairly easy to discard. From the zygote forward, there is growth and development and cellular differentiation and different stages of embryonic development until birth, and then forward after birth, but there is no stage. What stage, if it's not immediate ensoulment, if it's delayed ensoulment at any stage after fertilization, at what stage would we posit the soul? You know, at what stage would God grant us a soul that is not the zygote? Would have to be a substantial change from a pre-human form to a fully human form. But if you think about embryonic development in the proper way and fetal development, and even after birth, you know, through the toddler, teenager, adult, senile, etc., there is no substantial change that happens at any stage beyond the zygote. There's no substantial change, philosophically speaking. It's all stages of development. It's all the same individual. It's all the same species. It's all the same individual. All right. It's just further development and development. But there's no stage that we can say, oh, yes, we're non-human until the blastocyst, for example, or until the heart starts beating, or until the brain forms. We're not human, and then we are human, or we're partially human, and then we're fully human. The problem with those arguments is that then we would say some humans are less human than others. And then who decides? A committee, the government, each one of us. It makes it totally subjective, right? But no, we're doing, Catholic bioethics is an objective bioethics because it's based on the biological facts. The biological facts is that there is no substantial change from the zygote until I hit the grave. There is body change, there is material change and development, but no substantial change where I would be able to say I was non-human and then I became human, or I was pre-human and then I became fully human, all right? However, from the sperm and ovum to the zygote, there is a substantial change. There is definitely a substantial change because the ovum is not a zygote, it's haploid, for example. It's actually a tissue of the mother. The sperm, again, haploid, tissue from the father. But neither one of these two cells, these precursors, are capable of living on their own, left alone. Without fertilization, excuse me, the end of an ovum is to die. And without fertilization, the end of a sperm is to die. But with fertilization, now we have a new cell that is capable, kept in its proper environment, to develop into a newborn, okay? It has all the machinery necessary, all the information necessary to develop. So it's logical to posit that God grants us all here. Also, there are certain things about God that he cannot be. God cannot be cruel, for example, you know? And if God were to leave a zygote without a soul, and let's say he gives the soul at the morula or the blastocyst stage, pretty early, you know, about 1 week after, he will leave the zygote literally soulless, right? And what if that zygote died in the first week of development? That zygote would be denied the possibility of eternal life and redemption. And that's the most cruel thing. To leave a human being soulless is the most cruel thing that we can imagine, because it leaves that human being without the possibility of redemption and eternal life ever, because there's no soul, okay? So we can conclude logically that delayed ensoulment is not sustainable, philosophically speaking. And yet, that was kind of the standing theory in the Middle Ages, way back, precisely because they had a defective biology. Even Thomas Aquinas was the great systematizer. We just celebrated his feast a few days ago. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century was the great systematizer of Catholic theology, right? Up until this day, Thomism and objective morality. And he believed in delayed ensoulment. He believed actually that the human soul was given to the boy before the girl. Okay, I think it was like 4 weeks for the boy and 8 weeks for the girl. And his reasoning for that was that obviously women are weaker than men, and so they would receive the soul later than men. It was a total defective anthropology that he had, and it was even more defective biology, because the human egg and the sperm were not really known at that time. Fertilization process was not really understood at the cellular level. It was not, because we're talking about the 1300s. The microscope only came in about 400 years later with Leeuwenhoek to be able to see a cell. And even the human ovum was not discovered into the late 1800s, 1880s with von Baer, all right? And so these cells were really not discovered, and the cell theory and all that was not around in the Middle Ages. So Aquinas had a very defective biology and a very defective anthropology also, thinking that because women are physically weaker than men, it made them actually anthropologically weaker, and they would receive the soul later. Okay? So with all his knowledge and everything else, he had, because of a very defective biology, he had the wrong understanding of ensoulment. Today, no theologian that is really worth his salt or her salt and knows some basic high school biology would sustain delayed ensoulment. All right? Okay. So we have to deal with this issue. If there is immediate ensoulment at the zygote, then what do we do with twinning? Because we just got through saying that the soul is indivisible. How do we get from one soul, two souls in monozygotic twinning, right? Okay, so we have to review twinning very briefly, which we have three types of twinning. We have dizygotic twinning, monozygotic twinning, and then conjoined twinning. So dizygotic, keep in mind the prefix di means two, dos. And it means that, how do we get dizygotic twinning? How many eggs? 2 eggs. 2 eggs. In other words, that woman in that cycle ovulated 2 eggs or more. You know, she's got 2 ovaries at the end of the day. So the 2 eggs can come from the 1 ovary or from both ovaries. And she could even ovulate more than 2 eggs, 3 or 4 eggs. Now what's going to happen? How many sperm do we have around? Millions and millions, right? By the time they get to the ampulla, there could still be thousands or tens of thousands of sperm who are around there. So whatever egg is around, on average, is going to get fertilized. And so dizygotic twins come from 2 eggs that were fertilized by 2 sperm, and therefore they're 2 individuals from the beginning, because we have 2 zygotes from the beginning, okay? And therefore, just God infuses a soul in each one of those 2 zygotes. That is also why dizygotic twinning, dizygotic twins, right? They're also known as what? Fraternal twins, fraternal twins. They can be boy-boy, girl-girl, or boy-girl, because they get fertilized by 2 sperm. You follow? So one sperm could have been an X sperm, the other sperm could have been a Y sperm. Okay, so fraternal twinning doesn't really present a challenge or a problem for immediate ensoulment, right? However, monozygotic twinning is a challenge. Okay, so here's dizygotic, no problem. Monozygotic. So monozygotic twinning, we have a single egg fertilized by a single sperm, which, as I mentioned before, within 2 weeks can split into 2 or more, all right? The typical split will happen at the morula stage when the cell is just beginning, when the morula is just beginning to subdivide into blastomeres. So remember, after the zygote, what kind of cellular division we have? Mitosis.
Mitosis.
Yep. Your ptosis, everybody's ptosis, okay? It just keeps going forever. Well, not forever, until the grave. And sometimes even a little beyond the grave, because different tissues die at different times. But the point is that it's just a cellular division, a duplication. And so typically the monozygotic twinning happens at the morula stage, which is that the cumulus, remember the cumulus, because the little embryo hatches, remember that little video of the embryo hatching, right? The blastocyst. Okay, so the cumulus is maintaining that little structure together. The morula is maintaining the morula together. In other words, the zona pellucida and the corona radiata. If that is compromised at some point, the cleavage can be total cleavage and go even through the zona and the corona and actually develop 2 individuals, all right? So, of course, this is very difficult to observe because this is normally occurring within a woman's uterus. Actually, in the fallopian tube, in travel. Of course, now with in vitro fertilization, it has actually been photographed and everything else. But the point is that the earliest stage that the twinning can occur is at the morula stage, but it can also occur later at the blastocyst stage, and even at the gastrula, in gastrulation, when the basic body plan is being formed, when that embryo elongates, right, towards a head region and a tail region, remember the gastrula, and then there is the pouring in of the ectoderm, the invagination and the neural groove and all that. Even at that point, the embryo can split, and typically the embryo will split in half and even grow because it grow normally. Two identical gastrulas, okay, will grow normally because that tissue is still very tender, very fresh. It's all typically pluripotent, so it has a lot of potentiality. The cells are very potent, and therefore two identical twins can come out of there, okay? And then tail, how do we know that the split happened at the morula, at the blastocyst, or at the gastrula? Depending on the embryonic sac, what they share together. If they have distinct placentas and distinct amniotic sac, the amnion, right, which is the tissue that surrounds the embryo, and that's encasing the embryo there, is soft tissue, then if they have distinct placentas and distinct embryonic sacs, then they split at the morula. If they are sharing a placenta but have distinct sacs, then they most likely split at the blastocyst, because remember the trophoblast is the one that generates the placenta, right? So if it's the blastocyst that splits, the ICM, the inner cell mass, they still have a common blastocyst, trophoblast, so they would share placenta. Whereas the morula, they would have two distinct trophoblasts. Follow? If they actually share a common placenta and a common embryonic sac, then it most likely happened at the gastrula stage later on, all right? But the bottom line, the window has been determined experimentally, for clinically, up to 2 weeks, which I just really find fascinating, that even within the first 2 weeks of embryonic development, one human can become 2 humans. Okay, so how do we deal with that philosophically and with the issue of ensoulment? And considering that the late ensoulment is not really an option and that the soul is indivisible. All right, let me fast forward here for a moment before I get to conjoin. And yeah, because this will be with regards to twin reabsorption. All right, so here's how we deal with it philosophically and theologically, philosophy being the tools of doing theology. Think of this scenario. For immediate ensoulment, fertilization, zygote, God grants a soul to this zygote. So we have a human being who has been ensouled, okay? Now, the twinning happens. Whether it happens at the morula, the blastocyst, or the gastrula, doesn't really matter. What matters is that from one individual, a second individual generated. Okay? At whatever stage, within those first 2 weeks. But now we have a second individual. The moment we have that second individual, what prevents God from positing a soul on that new individual? Does anything prevent God from granting a soul to the new individual? And the logical answer is no, there's nothing that prevents God. If God can grant a soul to the zygote, God can also grant a soul to a blastocyst or a gastrula or even a morula. Because you think about it, let's say the morula, which is the simplest case. If the morula totally separates, either at the first the first cleavage, let's say the earliest possibility of the twinning, the morula at the 2-cell stage, just after the first mitosis, that morula separates totally. And now we have 2 morulae, right? But each morula is now a single cell. So essentially, we have that zygote has reverted, those 2 morulas have reverted back to the zygote stage. Have actually reverted back to the zygote stage, and then each one of those 2 will split again and again and again and continue forward. Okay, so we have a biological explanation that is mechanical, that doesn't require any magic or saltation, skipping steps. There is a logical explanation. that is consistent with the biology. So, for example, at the morula stage, let's say that the split happens here. This morula stays with the original soul, and this is the new morula that receives a soul from God. Because now these two are distinct. So the second that those two become two distinct individuals, the one individual has a soul from the origin, from the zygote, and the other individual receives a soul at that point. What we will never know is which one of the two twins had the original soul and which one got the soul at the point of splitting. We would never know that. Maybe we'll know it in eternal life as a curiosity, okay? But one of the two may well have received the soul at the moment of splitting, okay? And again, that argument is also consistent at the blastocyst stage, whenever the split actually happens, when we have two distinct ICMs, then one of the ICMs is carrying the original soul, the other ICM receives a soul from God. The same argument can be made consistently without altering any of the biology for the gastrula. You follow? What do we have in effect? Biologically, what we're having is a form of asexual reproduction. It's a form of asexual reproduction, which, and this is basically, it's known as speculative biology, but I have held this point for years now. In fact, I came upon it when I was doing my PhD at Purdue in the 2000s, early 2000s, working with DNA, precisely the structure and function of DNA. I thought, well, functionally, this is really like a type of asexual reproduction, because we're getting from one individual, we're getting two, it's cloning. This is natural cloning in humans, this monozygotic twinning. And it has a logical explanation that doesn't do any violence to the biology. It leaves it alone. It respects the biology that is happening. And it is a type of asexual reproduction. You can think of it like a type of budding, all right? Maintains integrity of both individuals. And how can we justify it evolutionarily? We can say, well, maybe it's a vestigial function, because phylogenetically, we're also related to, so we're related to other primates, right? The other primates, for example, 99% compatibility with the chimp, 98% with the gorilla, 97% with the orangutan, but also with other monkeys in the 90th percentile, with other vertebrates, maybe in the 80th percentile. We're related to the frog, for example, by a percentage of homology of compatibility. I don't know what it is. I'm going to guess 70%, 60%, you know. We take it back. We're related to the fly, maybe 10%, 40%, who knows? So if we go back to more primitive organisms, we're related to the coelenterates. We're related to the hydras. We're related to the jellyfish, maybe 5–10% of our genome, right? And so there is a common homology there, and those coelenterates, their typical mode of reproduction is asexual, is budding. And so this could be a vestigial asexual reproduction that is embedded in very early in embryonic development, when we still have that genome that is so pristine that not all of the genes have expressed by any stretch of the imagination. We just have the beginning of the regulatory genes being expressed, you see? So we can share that twinning, that cloning as a type of asexual reproduction with other primitive organisms. And it maintains the biology, it doesn't do any violence to it. And there is a logical, reasonable explanation for explaining then the ensoulment of new individuals with a monozygotic twinning, okay? And that's why we can still maintain immediate ensoulment, either at the zygote level or for the twin at the morula, blastocyst, or gastrula stage, whenever that new twin developed. Okay. Moving forward, actually, the more challenging case would be conjoined twins. And these are some examples of conjoined twins. Some survive, some don't survive. It is very dramatic to see these conjoined twins actually survive. But this is an example. These were Guatemalan girls, the Mata girls, that were born very conjoined, as you can see. Here's a diagram of what they were sharing. They were sharing many organs, okay? But they had 2 distinct heads and 4 arms, 4 legs. And they were sharing many of the internal organs in the trunk region, but they had 2 hearts and kind of duplicate of the organ systems, all right? Especially the major organs in the body were duplicates. So they each had their own set. So they were basically conjoined mostly at the bone and muscle and skin level. Well, thanks be to God and fashion of modern medicine, they were separated at one point. I don't know when, but these are the Mata girls after their surgery. Okay, and they both survive, and there they are. Of course, underneath the clothing, there's going to be a lot of scars going back and forth through the body, okay? That's why they have the clothing on. But you can see a little bulging here, so certainly the trunk region is not going to be anatomically perfect because it was drastic, radical surgery that went on, but they were separated. Now, before the separation, just from looking at them, you know, they look very, very precarious, but we can say mostly from the head formation and the face expression, everything, these were definitely 2 individuals, okay? These two individuals, these were not one individual. Some conjoining is less traumatic, like in the case of this one, where you definitely have 2 individuals that are basically sharing some parts of the cranium, the cranial plates, all right, are fused together. But internally, they have 2 brains and they have 2 meninges and all the different layers that are encased in the brain, the soft tissue. And they have mostly 2 skulls, but they're sharing some of the plates and of course the skin. So this one is a relatively easy one to separate nowadays, all right? It's kind of the mild form of conjoined. This is the most dramatic form of conjoined and that is viable. These are the Henson girls. These are real life photos, okay, of real life human beings. Would you say that this is 1 individual or 2 individuals? Well, mostly from the head, these are definitely 2 individuals. And in fact, what's even more important, what's inside the head is 2 brains, 2 separate brains. And therefore, if they're 2 separate functional brains, they're 2 minds. But they're stuck together for life, literally. So from the neck down, they share everything. All right? So 1 trunk, 1 heart, 1 liver, 1 digestive tract. How the esophagus connects down there is, I don't know, but the esophagus has to connect at some point. Actually, I don't really know if they have 2 stomachs or 1 stomach, if they connect at the pylorus or, you know, they basically have 1 major organ from the trunk down. So they're stuck together for life, but they're 2 individuals. And because they've been like this always, since the gastroless stage, we don't know exactly when the twinning happened, they're extremely familiar with one another and they share all the body functions, you know, in common, but they're 2 individuals. They're 2 individuals. And we have to get used to the fact that these are 2 individuals that deserve very much our respect and their dignity, and they have 2 souls. Okay? And God will figure it out. The glorified body, you know, maybe they become individualized, who knows? But the point is that we're looking at 2 individuals. And so it's hard to tell. We'd have to go case by case, whether we have 1 or 2 individuals. But in all of these cases, I think that we have 2 individuals, and it's mostly because of the head formation. But the head is an external, is telling us what's happening internally, okay? And especially the face, which I'll talk about prosopon in a minute, the countenance, the face tells us that this girl is an individual, this girl's an individual, even before the separation, these 2 fellows and these 2 girls are two individuals. In fact, conjoined twinning has become a whole science in embryology and fetology and neonatology. So there are embryologists and neonatologists, MDs, who specialize in this field, super specialization. And they have actually figured out with this diagram, which can represent either they can represent the zygote, the morula, or the blastocyst, but most likely the gastrula and the central disc. This is the central disc of the gastrula. It's a little small, but you see this tear-shaped structure here, okay? This, oh here, okay. This represents the central disc or the embryonic disc of the gastrula, already elongated and bilateralized, bilateral. So you see this would be the head region and this would be the tail region. And so it has already been figured out the type of conjoining that would happen depending on where the splitting occurs at the gastrula stage, okay? And so I found this fascinating, this diagram, that it has now been figured out, and you have all these possibilities, A through KI, of possibility of twinning. From the point of sharing just, they have two individuals that they share just a back together or a butt together, they start just by the rump, right? Or all the way, most dramatic, to definitely a single body and a single head, and maybe at most two faces at the opposite end of more dramatic sharing, all right? Here's even a diagram of the head with the eyeballs and the brain and the level of sharing, left and right and so forth. So it's just amazing how it has been diagrammed out into all the various possibilities. Okay, so that's good. And so that's why I say we'd have to go case by case. For example, these two that are joined at the ventral region, at the belly, we would say basically they're two individuals. This one, they're sharing the belly and the thorax, but it's mostly external, two individuals. Here, one face elongated, maybe two brains. Many of these are non-viable, okay, will not survive or will die very early on. My guess is that someone like this that has one face but two internal brains, those two brains are degenerate, non-viable. If they make it to birth, they will die very soon after birth. And it's anyone's guess if they're one or two individuals, can't really tell. These two, so mostly based on the head and the face, we can tell if they're one or two individuals, okay? All right. Anyway, we don't need to figure it out. The good Lord can figure it out if he's donating a soul or not. The point is that if we have two individuals, we have a rational explanation that is consistent with the biology for having two ensoulments that are immediate ensoulments. Now, twin reabsorption. This one is more challenging, in my mind, because we go from one individual, two individuals in twinning, monozygotic, but then one of the two twins vanishes, disappears, and actually gets reabsorbed by the twin, by the living twin, okay? By the surviving twin. And so we go back to one individual again, all this before birth. So what's going on, Professor? What's going on with twin reabsorption and the soul? You know, we're going from one soul to two souls, okay? So you gave us an explanation there, but then how do those two souls get reduced to one soul again? Okay, well, let's go through it. Here's, for example, a sonogram of a vanishing twin, what is known clinically as a vanishing twin. There was, early on in this pregnancy, another twin here that is disappearing, okay? And sometimes this twin gets reabsorbed by the surviving twin, and sometimes not. It just degenerates and becomes a mass if there's anything left over. That means that this embryo obviously died early on, and then the tissue was being either reabsorbed by the endometrium or by the kind of cannibalized by the surviving twin. All right. So they're known as either vanishing twins or parasitic twins. Here's some actual examples of some people who have survived with a vanishing twin stuck. All right. So this person, can't really tell, man or woman, I think it's a woman. She has this other twin reabsorbed in her back, but you can tell that this twin is not really fully formed by any stretch of the imagination. There seems to be a head region here and some semblance of an eyeball forming, and then some appendages forming here, which can't really tell, some kind of lower appendage. Just from the diagram, this is probably the abdominal region, so this would be maybe the hip, who knows? But this is definitely non-viable. Was this an individual, really a human being, a human individual that would deserve receiving a soul? In my opinion, no, but it depends. Only God knows really if this really received the soul or not. Here's another very dramatic case of this baby who looks, does this baby look fairly normal to you? Let's omit from the crown of the head up. For now, don't look at this, okay? From the crown of the head down, does this baby look normal? Pretty much, especially again, the face. This baby looks pretty tranquil, sleeping there. We can assume that there's a fairly normal functioning brain inside. But then the vanishing twin got stuck here, conjoined, and did this fellow develop? You know, it's just a head, there's no trunk. There's some kind of semblance of a face here. There's obviously a mouth, some teeth sticking out. There's some form of a nose. There seems to be eyebrows and some attempt of an eyelid. We don't know if there are eyeballs behind this. We don't know what kind of a brain is there, but it looks enlarged, probably hydrocephalic, accumulated water, and certainly degenerate. This is definitely non-viable. Definitely non-viable. So clinically, actually, when we look at it, clinically, it's fairly easy surgical extirpation here of this conjoined twin to the surviving twin, right? Also, because think about it. The tissue here, right, at least up until this point, it looks living tissue. It's not necrotic, it's not dying. It looks more or less the same pale skin color as the baby, all right, with some hair, which involves living follicles, hair follicles. And internally, we can assume that there's some organs and tissues in there, maybe a hydrocephalic brain that is physically growing. So, and where is this twin getting its nourishment from? Since there's no trunk, there's no life support. The life support is this other fellow. So we can assume that there is tremendous vascularization going on here, right? Literally sucking up blood and nutrients from this other baby. And so this is indeed a parasitic twin, right? It's parasitizing on this other. But is this really a human being? Okay, I think it's very safe to assume that this is not a human being, all right? It's a grossly deformed parasitic twin. So ethically, it would be justifiable to cut here and to save the life of this baby, because going forward, this baby is unlikely to survive with this on his or her head, all right? And so it is ethically justifiable to cut here and save this baby. And one could do, I think that one could make an argument for a provisional baptism if the parents want it, all right? Provisional baptism in case, leave the benefit of the doubt to God, in case this twin has a soul, okay? But it really is highly unlikely, highly improbable. At any rate, for the life of this baby, you know, this is a type, a very dramatic type of a parasitic twinning. Now, how about the soul? The soul itself for parasitic, for conjoined twinning, and for twin reabsorption. Here's a plausible explanation. We start with a zygote with one soul. Then the split happens at any one of the three stages. We end up with two souls. And then reabsorption happens. In other words, when reabsorption happens, there is a death of one of those twins, okay? If this was alive at some point, this is now dead as a human being, And so the twin that survives maintains the surviving soul. The twin that dies, the twin is being reabsorbed, all right? That twin has actually died, humanly speaking. And so that soul is now released from the deformed body, and that soul goes to the mercy of God, okay? And therefore, we can also provide a logical, philosophical, and theological explanation for immediate ensoulment in the case of twin reabsorption. Whenever the reabsorption happens, that twin as a human being has died and that soul has been released, just like our soul is released at the time of our death. As long as, what is the provision? Because this could happen anywhere from the zygote forward or from the morula forward, really, when we have the possibility of twinning, okay? It could happen at the morula stage that the other twin is reabsorbed. It can happen at blastocyst or the gastrula or later in the embryonic development. As long as we maintain this provision, all right, this premise, that there is no minimal time required beyond the zygote to be human. In other words, once we have a human zygote, then that human zygote may receive a human soul. All right? If we don't put a time requirement after the zygote for receiving a human soul, then we can hold this hypothesis here, this explanation for twin reabsorption. Follow? Because what we have essentially is, at the split, we have the two souls, we have the two individuals, and then at the reabsorption, one of the two twins dies, and that soul is released, okay? And so we have, what does this mean? It means that we have embryonic souls in heaven, or in the presence of God, or in God's mercy, to determine by God's judgment whether where this soul is going to spend the rest of its eternity. In fact, I'll tell you more. Even normal embryonic development, we can assume that there are many souls in heaven that are embryonic souls, in this sense. You know that I talked about spontaneous abortion. Oh, we're going to talk about spontaneous abortion actually coming. Okay, let me bracket that thought because we're going to pick it up after the break with abortions. I'm talking about spontaneous abortion as opposed to a procured abortion, actually. Okay, we'll talk about that because we have one of the highest rates of spontaneous abortion in the animal kingdom, up to about 50% globally. What I'm saying is that about 50% of human pregnancies normally don't make it to term. They're lost. And so when it's early on, it's called spontaneous abortion. Later, after in the fetal stage, it's called a miscarriage, okay? But there was no guilt or fault because it was not procured abortion. It just happened spontaneously. We'll talk about it in a few minutes. Okay, so you follow me. I'm giving you arguments here for the possibility of sustaining that life begins at fertilization, that we have a human individual with a soul at the zygote at fertilization, even if there is monozygotic twinning and even if there is twin reabsorption. We can give a logical explanation that does not do any violence to the biology of what's happening. Okay. Okay. I'll save this little thing for, you saw this video already, the Saria State video of embryonic development. Now I want to, questions, anyone?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Chris?
So my question is, I'm trying to like wrap it around my head, but what would be the purpose for God allowing all these like deformations and the parasitic twins? Like, why would He allow that? Like, what is He trying to tell us when these things happen?
Right, yes. Okay, so God is the author of the universe. God is also the author of nature. In fact, we talk about natural law, which we saw quite a bit of it in the first course, right, of phylogenetic development, evolution. It follows certain laws. And so natural law really is a reflection of divine law. And then we have positive law, civil law, that should be a reflection of natural law when it's a good law, so we maintain the dignity of the human person. But basically, God allows, it's not that God actively desires these things to happen, but God allows them. And what is your intuition of what's happening here when we compare all these deformities to normal, natural, complete births? They're genetic defects. They're genetic defects. They're mutations. We don't know where the mutation happened. If the mutation could have been in the sperm, in the egg, in the zygote, in the morula, but these are genetic defects. Okay. In fact, kind of anticipating the next lecture on spontaneous abortions, the vast majority of spontaneous abortions carry some kind of genetic defect. All right. And so these are dead ends, basically. These are, and then natural selection acts on it. And most of these are non-viable. They don't make it through pregnancy. A few do. I mean, if they do, then they typically don't survive for a few hours, a few days, a few weeks. Some, in these dramatic cases, actually get to survive into adulthood. Then there's medicine to help them in whatever way. But basically, God is respectful of the laws that He Himself invented. And because the genetics, the DNA is a physical, material, molecular matter existence, it is subject to change. It is subject to change. And we call those changes in DNA mutations, okay? And so they happen. These things that are happen, and God is respectful of the laws that He Himself created. So these are essentially genetic defects. Some are viable. Most, the vast majority, are non-viable. And so he allows these things to happen because He is respectful of the laws that He Himself created. But because we necessarily, for now, have to live in a material world, this material world is subject to influence. It's dynamic, all right? And it's subject to influence, internal and external influences, which at the genetic level, at the DNA level, we call them mutations. One of the four forces of evolution, precisely, right? So in the bigger picture, this actually is a kind of an internal purification of the race, because again, most of these non-viable defects will not make it and will not mate, will not reproduce, and therefore they're dead ends. You know, that mutation will not be passed on to the next generation, And also, I can tell you, I failed to mention this, but typically many of these conjoined twins, their sexual organs are non-functional. Either they're degenerate or anatomically or physiologically non-functional, or both. Okay, so really, again, with all due respect to the individuals, they will not pass on their genetic defect to the next generation because the reproductive organs are non-functional, either at the anatomical or at the physiological level, or many times even at both levels. Okay, is that a reasonable answer?
Yes, yes, thank you. I have a follow-up question.
Yep.
So I understand now, he respects his natural law, but would you say that all these defects are caused by original sin? Because
Right.
I can imagine that God never wanted his humanity to live in with like so much disease and with so much deformations.
I'm having difficulty understanding the question. It's kind of echoed. I don't know if you're either too close or too far to your mic. What kind of microphone do you have? Is it on your laptop or?
Well, I had my headphones. Can you hear me now?
Oh, much better, much better. Thank you. Okay. Yes.
So, my question was, would all these mutations and all the disease and everything like that's negative, biologically, do you think that is considered, it happens because of original sin? Like that's the main cause of it? Because I can imagine that God never wanted humanity to have these defects. He wanted like a perfect humanity.
Right. Yes, but not original sin, okay? Not original sin because we also see this phenomenon happening in nature. In other words, in other species. In generally less, or at least that I'm aware of, also because, in nature, they really don't survive. They get eaten up. If a conjoined giraffe is born, for example, if that conjoined giraffe makes it through pregnancy, that conjoined giraffe is not going to get away from the lion that is just a few minutes away. And so we may not actually see it, all right? And it's hard to document. But these defects also happen in the rest of nature, which obviously don't have original sin or personal sin, right? A lion is not guilty of murder when he takes down a zebra. It's just instinct and it's part of natural law. So no, not original sin. Rather, in my mind, rather it points to our temporality and the fact that we're not here permanently, and we have to be very careful with modernity and modern convenience and well-being, because one of the side effects, in my opinion, negative side effects of well-being is that it gives us a sense of security and false security that we're comfortable here and we can only get more comfortable and a better lifestyle, and that we're going to stay like this, but we're not going to stay like this because we're all going to die, either of old age, decrepit, or tragically from an accident prematurely. But no one has survived death yet. Even Christ and Mary had to undergo until they were either ascended or assumed. But you follow me? That this
Yes.
life is temporary, and because it's temporary, it's not going to be perfect either. We're only here for a time, but not original sin, because then that would be positing guilt and saying that somehow these individuals were more sinful than we were, all right? Or that they deserve this somehow. No. Original sin is uniform for all because of the fragmentation, because of a disobedience in our first fathers, because of that sense of independence. In a sense, we cannot perpetuate original sin when we seek consciously or subconsciously the independence from God, continuous independence from God, again, because each individual has to make that choice at some point in his or her life, whether to consider God or not, and then that's the independence that I'm saying well-being could give us when we have control of our lives, and the more control we have, the more control we want. So beware of well-being. It can deceive us into thinking that we're going to be here kind of forever and that we are in full control, but we're not really. Okay, it's a very humbling thing to see these conjoining twins. It's humbling, and it should elicit in us an act of gratitude that we were not born this way, but that if we were born this way, that God would also give us the grace to live gracefully this way. Okay, so we cannot say ever that the handsome girls, that Abby and Brittany are either suffering or in pain or hate each other or hate the world or curse God for their predicament. We cannot say that. They could be very well happy girls, okay? They can well be happy girls. And it's just that other people are different from them. And that's their perspective. In fact, there have been studies done on conjoined twins and identical twins that some of them regret having been separated. For the ones that can be separated fairly easily and so forth, or even difficultly. Some later on, they say, I miss my twin, I miss the conjunction, I miss the attachment, literally, you know. Anyway, it's not a course in psychology. There's a lot more in there. But any other questions or comments? Okay, I think this is a good time to break. You need to move over this a little bit. Let me leave the prosopon for when we come back after the break. We can thaw out a little bit, okay? And we'll pick up on the first hot topic here, which will be abortion. So let's take a few minutes now, just under 11, let's say until about, come back in about 10 minutes, okay? Okay, everyone, welcome back. So we left off with the big picture of allowing for the possibility of immediate ensoulment at the completed fertilization at syngamy, even with the possibility of monozygotic twinning and also twin reabsorption. We can find a logical, reasonable explanation for those two biological phenomena without doing violence either to the biology, the philosophy, or the theology of immediate ensoulment on the human being. I now want to pick up on the third issue, which is a human person, all right? Well, I mean, human being, I think that this one is fairly easy to argue, you know, is a human embryo a human being? Well, if the human embryo is not a human being, what kind of being is it? Because being, the word being is kind of redundant. When we see a dog, we don't say a dog being, right? But for some reason, when we see a human, we say human being. But all living creatures are beings. You know, there is a fly being, there is a pine being. We just don't put the adjective to it. But for the human embryo, we just have an embryonic human being or embryonic human, right? Because if the embryo is not a human being, then what kind of being is it? It's by species. In other words, it has the genetic material of the species, of the human species. But the one that is perhaps most challenging is human person, and this will dovetail into the case of abortion, because really what we have in the United States since 1973 is precisely that the human embryo was denied personhood, But it was denied a particular personhood, not anthropological personhood, but rather legal personhood, which is very important because it literally means the distinction between life and death for some people. But to the original question of the ontological status of the human embryo, can we say that the human embryo is a person? And can we say that the human zygote is a person, right? He or she, excuse me, he or she certainly doesn't look like a person, the single cell, and even the morula, or the blastocyst, or the gastrula doesn't look like a person. Well, he or she doesn't look like a born person, like you and I look like a person, right? Because we're familiar to looking at born people. But really, when you think about it, the zygote looks exactly how the zygote should look like at that stage. And the morula the same. But let's look at the origin, at the etymology of the word person, okay? Where are we here? Let's look at the etymology of person. And this, I discovered this when I was in Rome doing my first doctorate in the 1990s, doing research, reading for my dissertation, which was precisely on fetal surgery before there was a possibility for that. I'll talk about that toward the end of this course. But basically, I ran across some articles that were talking about the prosopon. And I was intrigued by the prosopon because it turns out that prosopon is the original word, the Greek for person, all right? The Greek, just like zygon is the Greek for zygote. And look at this. Prosopon, when we translate prosopon today from the Greek, it means mask. It's the mask. So look at this connection, how interesting. It comes from classical Greece, again, 200 to 300 years, 300 years before the time of Christ. Keep in mind that Western civilization basically has its cultural origin in classical Greece, right? It has its agricultural origin centuries earlier in Mesopotamia, in the Middle East. But really for culturally, it was classical Greece. Again, about 300, 400 years before the time of Christ. Philosophically, the big names, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, but also in mathematics, in physics, in astronomy, in the arts, in ethics, you name it. It was happening in classical Greece centuries before the time of Christ. For example, architecture. Here we have what is known as a Greek amphitheater. Amphitheater, open air, of course, is the Mediterranean, so it's a very benevolent climate. This, by the way, is a particular ecosystem that's called chaparral. We'll see it in the summertime when we look at the different biomes of the world. It's kind of unique around the Mediterranean. And, but anyway, these are rolling hills. This is somewhere in Greece. And their architecture, again, form follows function, was designed according to the sound wave propagation. So that obviously there was no megaphones back then or microphones or anything of that sort. That technology just didn't exist. But a person speaking here with a loud voice, of course, but could be heard all the way up to the upper tiers of the theater, of the amphitheater. And that's precisely because of the way it's designed. You could almost think of it as the base of a speaker, the big speaker, the waffle, all right, that has this kind of shape. And it's the wave propagation. So the actual theater propagates the wave and expands it. It's kind of counterintuitive, but I've also noticed this sound issue with in churches. The higher the ceiling of the church inside, the more loud it sounds. You would think it's the opposite, but actually low ceilings, churches that have a low drop ceiling, kind of like a cave, for example, or a chapel or a crypt, the sound doesn't really propagate much. The sound breaks up and doesn't propagate. But a high ceiling church, for example, a Gothic church that is very vertical, right, and peaks at the top, the sound propagates out from the altar way out into the last pews. It's amazing, but it's actually a characteristic of sound that the more space it has, that wave propagates and amplifies to the point that in the Gothic churches of the Middle East, of the Middle Ages, the choir was literally behind the altar, and it would go up into the apse, which was a semicircular shape like this, and that apse actually was imitating like the crown of the head of the skull, and then it projected the sound forward into the main body of the church. Something similar to what happens to our voice. We don't realize this normally, but our vocal cords are here. The sound that I'm making is penetrating through my brain and hitting the cranium, my cranium, which is a higher density skull, and is projecting that sound forward. It's actually, so my skull is amplifying my sound, my voice, all right? And it's an anatomical thing. Anyway, all that to say that these guys were basically geniuses. And the theater developed, it was a mythology. It was their religion, which was polytheistic, right? They believed in many gods. And the gods were very passionate. We talked about that a little bit last semester. But basically, theater represented, it was dramatizing their theology. They would act their Greek mythology. And the original theater was tragedy, Okay, you know that the different masks represent, for example, tragedy is looking down, the faces that are down, all right, are tragic. And then the mouth up is, so most of these are tragic, actually. I didn't realize it was. These are Greek masks. Oh, here's a happy one, okay. So this represents comedy. But comedy came after. The original Greek, classical Greek play was tragedy, because they had a fatalistic view of humans. Really, we were at the disposal of the gods. And the gods could do with us, gods and goddesses could do with us whatever we want. They would trick us and play tricks on us and stuff like that, okay? And so it was a fatalistic mythology that they had, and they represented that in the theater. So the original theater was really a tragedy. And then what happened was that the humans had to do certain jobs to please, certain works to please the gods, and that's where heroes come in. For example, Ulysses and with the Odyssey, right? The famous book of the Odyssey, the drama. And then also Hercules, they had to do all these works, right? To please the gods. Anyway, it was the protagonist, the actor, who was typically a man, was a single actor. And he would represent all the different gods and goddesses. And what he would do is he would actually be sitting down or maybe standing up, and he would have a table in front of him. And then he would have all these masks. And when he wanted to represent Zeus, he would pick up the mask of Zeus and speak. So that's why the mouth is open, you see, the eyes so that he can see the public, but the mouths are open because he would take up the mask of Zeus and speak like Zeus, and that was representing him, Zeus. And then maybe it was the turn of Jupiter, so he would pick up the mask of Jupiter and speak through the mask as Jupiter. And Neptune and all the gods and the goddesses, that they were all different masks. And that's the prosopon. So the mask simultaneously reveals and conceals, you see? Because what was important about the theater? Not the protagonist, but not the actor, but the figure that was being represented, okay? So the actor, people couldn't care less about the actor. Of course, they were very famous. They had loud voices and so forth, but they wanted to know which god or goddess was speaking, all right? Which personaje, how do you say personaje in English? Character, thank you. It was the character that was important. And so the mask both reveals and conceals. Reveals the character, but conceals the actor, right? Okay, so that's the origin of person, comes from prosopon. And so today, what are we talking about? We're talking about the face. We're talking about the countenance of people. You notice that we all have different faces. We all have individual faces. We all have personal faces. Our faces are personalized. Then from the neck down, we're pretty much more or less the same in different proportions, but we pretty much have more or less the same organs and tissues and systems from the neck down. But our face, our countenance is personal, is personalized. And then what happens? We have so many muscles that are attached to the face. It's bewildering how we can express joy, anger, fear, all kinds of sentiments through the face, through the countenance. At the same time, we can conceal what we are really thinking. And I say that only two people really know what I'm thinking right now, myself and God. But I can be thinking many, many things. I could be out of this classroom for a second somewhere else, you know, thinking of the great lunch I'm going to have or something, and nobody knows it. Because the countenance both reveals and conceals the person. And so that's the person, okay? So from that perspective, tapping into the etymology of the word prosopon, I say that the zygote is actually the best human person because it both reveals and conceals who he or she is. There's a human being there, but it's concealed in the genetics. But if we know the genetics and we know the biology, we realize that this is an individual. This is the first individual of a new, the first stage of a new individual. So it's both revealing and concealing who he or she is. Given enough time and left alone, he or she will follow normal development and be born, and then continue development and become an adult and so forth. So I think that philosophically, we can hold and sustain that, yes, the human embryo is also a human person at a different stage of development, obviously. Doesn't have the physical face that we have yet, will acquire a face from about the 8th week forward. And that face is actually, as we saw in the films, will actually start moving and opening and closing the eyes and sucking the thumb and sucking the toes, right? But it's all gradual. It's a gradual development. But personhood, you know, these are categories. That's another thing we have to be very careful. These are categories that do not allow graduality. Let me say this, write it in. Okay, what I mean by graduality is that degrees, you know, with either an individual or not an individual. We cannot be half an individual, 3/4 of an individual, okay? We're either an individual or we're not an individual. We're either a human being or we're not a human being. We cannot be a partial human being or 3/4 human being, okay? And again, we're either a human person or not. These are all or none categories, okay? It's just like we're either dead or alive. Yeah, we can be half dead, but that's analogically speaking. When we're half dead, we're definitely alive. We may be in the dying process, but we haven't died. If we died, we died. So these categories, these philosophical categories and existential categories, they don't allow for graduality or degrees. They're either all or none categories, okay? There are other things in life that allow for graduality big time. For example, development and so forth. But these are basic fundamental categories that it's either all or not. So we deposit them on the human embryo or not. Of course, the Supreme Court in that time was not thinking in these terms at all, was thinking more in ideological terms that have been influenced and rather intimidated by a radical feminism of the time in the 1970s of women who wanted to legalize abortion. And so Norma Mccorvey was manipulated by 3 lawyers specifically to put her case forward into the Supreme Court, to keep pushing it from Texas all the way up the court system. Getting ahead of myself a little bit, but basically, okay, so you see, I'll rearrange the order of the slide later. You see how we can also claim human personhood for the unborn, existentially. Okay. All right. Finally, just to emphasize a little bit, I don't know if you've ever heard an ultrasound of an unborn, but this is basically what it sounds like. It's a little fast. Boom, 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 boom. It's about 150 beats per minute. If a human heart were doing that, that person is going into heart attack. Okay, born. But this is the unborn. And that's the normal heartbeat for an unborn. Because they need a lot of circulation. It's growing so fast that they need nourishment, all the tissues, 5,000 times the original size, right? And so the heartbeat is very fast, but that heart can take it. Then as the baby is born, okay, this is somebody's sonogram that they posted online. You hear it's very fast. One time I went into a pro-life clinic and counseling clinic, and I heard the sonogram for the first time, and I freaked out. This one, I didn't realize that it was that fast, but it has its biological explanation, of course. Okay, so let's go to our topic here of controversy, which is abortion. And we're going to be looking at first some medical terminology, then abortion methods, and finally alternatives to abortion, healthy alternatives to abortion, okay? First, we have really two types of abortions. So we have either spontaneous abortions or procured abortions. And spontaneous abortions, when they happen a little later in the pregnancy, are called miscarriage. Whereas procured abortions are also known as elective or induced or voluntary. And of course, in spontaneous abortion, there is no guilt or fault involved. It typically involves some kind of genetic defect. Oh yes, so I mentioned about 50% of human pregnancies never make it to term globally. All right, so that's a very high rate of spontaneous abortions or miscarriage or pregnancy loss, and it's natural. Most of these embryos or fetuses, when they were analyzed in the lab, it turns out that they had genetic defects. So it was a natural selection process that was going on. And it also means existentially that most of us probably have a brother or a sister that we've never met. Because 50% and we're alive, it means that on average, our mothers had either a miscarriage or spontaneous abortion. And most of them happen in the first 2 weeks of pregnancy, precisely, right? The first 2 weeks, many times, it's about 95% of them happen in that stage, the spontaneous abortions. And so many times the woman doesn't even know. She thinks she's just late on her period or something like that. And she's actually, instead of passing the menstruation, she's actually passing a little tiny embryo that died because had some kind of genetic defects. And she doesn't really realize that it was a spontaneous abortion, okay? So that's the biology on the spontaneous abortion. I'm not gonna talk about it more. And now I'm going to concentrate, of course, on the procured or elective abortion, which is the one where the will is engaged, the human will. So, I don't know why I have these slides out of sequence. Anyway, so from the clinical perspective, procured abortion, also known as elective, right, are very different types depending on they're described clinically as, for example, a threatened abortion when the woman is bleeding, pregnant woman is bleeding, and she may have an abortion, all right? It's called a threatened abortion. It can happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Then spontaneous, I spoke about already. Habitual is, unfortunately, a woman that keeps losing her pregnancies more than twice, and so she has difficulty holding on to the pregnancy. Induced is the one that we're going to be talking about, or procured or elective. A complete abortion is when all the products of conception have actually been exited, have come out of the woman's body, and there's no parts of the abortion left, including the placenta, because if any tissue is left inside the mother, then that tissue can actually rot and cause massive infection and sepsis, and the mother can die, so it's very dangerous. Missed abortion is when the baby dies, and is not expelled and stays inside the mother, okay? And and sometimes there is one that is even very strange. It occurs seldom, but it does occur when the baby was at the fetal stage already, but died, and there were twins, or typically they were twins, and the other twin, the surviving twin, kept growing and literally squeezed the dead baby against the wall of the uterus, and the other dead baby became thin, and it's called papyriform, like a paper, because the other baby is now just a flat, like a two-dimensional flat surface, right? Dead, obviously, and was literally squeezed up against the uterus by the surviving baby. It's a very rare case, but that's obviously the case of a missed abortion, the sense that the baby died, the unborn, the embryo or fetus died, but was not expelled, and the mother didn't have any significant symptoms either to detect a second embryo or fetus in there. Now, of course, today with sonogram, with ultrasound, that's the thing. When a woman is pregnant, she should be checking herself periodically for the ultrasound, making sure that the pregnancy is going forward normally, all right? Finally, miscarriage is after the 8th week, typically, when the embryo switches to fetal name, right? So, but the baby is more formed, the unborn is more formed, so it's called miscarriage. These are some of the statistics. Estimated 60 billion. This is already a little late, from about 3 years ago. Now it's about 62 million or 63 million abortions since 1973. It's an average of 1.5 million per year abortions that are procured, that are intentional, okay? And this is the one that we're talking about because we're talking about a human life, a human being, a human embryo. Also want to mention, some women don't know this, they may be on the pill or the IUD. These devices may be abortifacient in addition to the contraceptive effect that they have. So a secondary effect may be that they cause abortions because they render the endometrium inhospitable. Remember the endometrium? I had a little diagram here earlier. Okay. So the endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus. And remember that implantation happens 5 to 7 days after fertilization, and it happens through the walls of the endometrium. Now, what does the pill do? What the pill does is it fools the endometrium. Basically, typically it's high dosage of estrogen, and it fools the endometrium into thinking that it's pregnant. And so the endometrium thins out and becomes inhospitable for a subsequent pregnancy, you see, because it thinks that it's already pregnant. Because of the high dosage of estrogen, it's simulating basically the pill, and that's why the pill is on a daily basis, because there's a different dosage every day. You notice, I guess it starts here, all right, and it goes this way, and then spiraling like that. Oops. And ending here, these are placebos. The whites are placebos, but the woman still has to take it to make sure that she takes a pill every day, all right? But these have a varying dosage of estrogen that mimics the cycle if the woman were pregnant. And so it's fooling, by biochemical signal, it's fooling her reproductive organs into thinking that she's pregnant, so she will not ovulate. This will suppress ovulation because, you know, it's a pregnancy, so why should an egg be wasted in ovulating again, right? These are signals that happen normally in the pregnancy. When a woman is pregnant, normally, on average, she's not ovulating during the pregnancy, so 9 eggs are saved there for the 9 months. So that's what the pill does. It fools the body into thinking that it's pregnant. And part of that is to render the endometrium inhospitable. right, to a second pregnancy, supposedly. And so when that embryo comes along, if there is intercourse and there is breakthrough ovulation is that in spite of the signal, the fallopian tube, the ovaries do what they're supposed to do, the follicle matures and produce an egg, which does happen for women on the pill. Then that egg gets fertilized if there is intercourse, and then along comes the embryo, finds an inhospitable uterus and is discarded, and then we have actually an early abortion. And that's the, it's not very common, but it can happen there. And by the way, I mentioned that women can get pregnant by taking the pill, yes, because no method of contraception, we'll see it in the next lecture on contraception, is 100% effective. It's anywhere between 95 to 99%, which means that let's take the higher rigor of 99%. 1 in 100 women who are taking the pill every day will get pregnant, to get that statistic, okay? Oh, no, it's much higher than that, Professor. Okay, 99.9%, fine, 99.9, no pharmaceutical company that makes the pill will claim that because they'll get sued out of the water, but let's assume that it's 99.9%. Well, that means that 1 out of 1,000 women who are taking the pill will get pregnant taking the pill, all right? To get that statistic of 1 in 1,000. Now you multiply that up, you blow it up to, we are 330 million people in the United States. Not all are women, half are women, so it's 160, 170 million people. When you do that statistic up there, then you got hundreds of thousands of women who can get pregnant while taking the pill because of the 99.9% effectiveness, right? Because of the 0.1% or 0.1 or 0.1, whatever it is. So that's the argument there. The other one, the IUD, uterine device, also because it does the same effect mechanically as opposed to chemically. So what the pill does chemically is to suppress ovulation and to thin out the uterus, but the IUD, which is inserted in the uterus, touching the uterus physically, also fools the uterus into thinking that it's pregnant. So it will thin out also. In fact, the modern IUDs not only have the copper wire and whatnot, but also they have slow release estrogen on their tips. So they're also releasing estrogen. So it's a combination really. These are the modern IUDs. So bottom line, the IUD also fools the reproductive system into thinking it's pregnant. So if true pregnancy happens, many times that embryo will not implant, will be discarded, and that is to get an abortion. Let me finish this one and then put a counterclaim from the pro-choice people in a minute. But the third one is the morning after pill, plan B, right? Basically, the morning after pill is all these 30 pills into 2. In other words, it's a super high dosage, it's a mega dosage of estrogen. And then in 24 to 48 hours later, another mega dosage of estrogen to basically shock the reproductive system of the woman into thinking it's pregnant, and therefore to discard any new pregnancy that is going to happen, all right? So the morning after pill, also known as Plan B, which can be sold over the counter now, is a mega dosage of the regular pill of estrogen, shocking the body, the reproductive organ, into thinking it's pregnant, and therefore discarding anything else that is around there, basically the little embryo. It's also a spermicide and all that, but if it fails to kill the sperm and the sperm may fertilize, it will then kill the embryo by not allowing it to implant, all right? So these 3 contraceptive methods may also be abortifacient. It's important to know that because many women don't know that. They may want to do contraception, but they don't want to do abortion, okay? Well, it's part of the package, unfortunately. And some people who argue, oh, but these are spontaneous abortions because it's the uterus that's naturally discarding the embryo. But they're not spontaneous abortion, ontologically speaking, because had it not been for any one of these 3 devices, that embryo would not have been discarded. And these 3 devices were put there willingly, not unwillingly, okay? No one forced women to do this. Actually, this was by choice. So by choosing any one of these 3 methods, she's also choosing the risk of having an early abortion. And therefore, these are not spontaneous abortions, philosophically speaking, they are actually procured abortions. It's just that many doctors, of course, will not tell their women, because these are all, these two are for by prescription, the IUD and the pill, will not tell, well, this may cause an abortion in you, okay? A few doctors are honest and will mention it, but most doctors do not, because they themselves many times don't believe that they are abortionists, that they are abortifacients. Okay, now, let's move forward a little bit, still on the clinical aspect of things here. There are actually different methods of abortion depending on the trimester. And that's also a reason for the sonogram, the ultrasound, the abortion clinics, after they have to do a sonogram to figure out in which trimester is the woman, because the method will change from trimester to trimester, okay? And so the three methods are either medical or surgical or a combination of both, actually. So the medical abortion is a chemical abortion, involves pills or chemical substances to expel the early embryo. The surgical abortions obviously are mechanical because it's literally dilating the cervix, going in there with surgical instruments, cutting up the embryo and sucking the remains out, essentially with a vacuum cleaner. So those are mechanical abortions, the surgical. And then sometimes it's a combination of both, because if the embryo or the fetus is born alive, is taken out alive, immediately, once the head comes out of the woman's body, immediately that fetus now becomes a human person, legally, a legal person. And the same abortionist who was trying to kill that fetus a few minutes ago, now by law has to do everything possible to save that fetus who is struggling for his or her life, you know, because it endured and survived an abortion. And you get these testimonies. You go online and you find testimonies of people giving their testimony that they survived an abortion. Some of them are deformed, some are less deformed, some are burnt up, but they actually survived an abortion. It's amazing, but it's real. Okay, so the different methods is important to know for the clinical perspective so that we have competency when we talk about abortion and the ills of abortion, and people understand that we know what we're talking about. All right, so let's go through this a little bit in some level of detail. This diagram is just illustrated in trimesters, the first trimester, the second trimester, and the third trimester. And so it gets basically more and more difficult to kill that embryo as the months advance, because there's more organs and tissues developing, and especially the bone structure becomes harder and harder, more calcified, and all that has to be extracted from the woman's womb, right, from the uterus. So the easiest abortions to do are in the first trimester, and typically they are chemical abortions or medical abortions. The woman takes certain pills that kills the early embryo, and then that embryo is discarded, is passed out, typically at home the first couple of weeks or first month in the toilet. And it's, again, like a double dosage, very similar to the morning after pill. She'll take one first dosage when she gets home and then wait 48 hours more or less and take the second dosage, and she'll go into all kinds of pains and cramps and vomiting and everything else. And at some point she will pass that embryo, who is now dead, into the toilet typically. All right, so that's the chemical abortion. It can also be mechanical, essentially by dilating the cervix and going in with a tube, which is called a cannula, and then sucking out the embryo literally with a vacuum. The vacuum can be mechanical or automatic or electric or manual and so forth. Basically, these are vacuum abortions. They're called vacuum abortions. Can be done only very early on when the embryo is still very tiny, up to the first 3 months, okay? By the way, the abortion pills that are used, actual abortion, not contraceptive, but actual abortion pills, are typically mifepristone and misoprostol are the two main pills that are used. They also have other names and brand names like RU486 for mifepristone and Zygote for misoprostol. RU46 is developed by Russell Uclaf. Russell Uclaf is a pharmaceutical company, very prestigious otherwise, in I think it's Switzerland. Russell Uclaf is the acronym. And 486 is because it took 486 trials to get this drug to work, to cause the actual abortion that we're looking for, okay? So that's the infamous number of RU486. Most people don't know that. Anyway, these are the two main abortion pills that are used in the first trimester. Then there's an overlap between the first and second trimester with a very, the most common procedure really is known as a DNC. DNC stands for dilation and curettage. Again, these are just clinical terms for meaning that the dilation is to dilate the cervix because the cervix is that muscle, that circle, not there. Here. The cervix is the circular muscle that is between the vagina and the uterus. And the cervix is really the opening into the uterus, okay, because the uterus is literally the internal organ of the woman. The vagina is really kind of an extension of the skin, if you will, open to the outside, but that cervix is that circular muscle, similar to the anus and the mouth. These are all circular muscles. They're also called sphincters. That is normally shut tight to prevent any foreign object coming into the woman's body, all right? We'll look at the cervix more in detail later when we get to natural family planning as one of the methods for avoiding pregnancy naturally. And that's one of the symptoms, the primary symptoms that is observed with NFP. But now back to dilation and curettage means that this cervix has to be dilated artificially because when there's a pregnancy, it is shut down tight, and actually there's a plug here that is called the cervical plug with thickened mucus to prevent any foreign object from going in there and infecting the baby and the mother and the pregnancy that's going on. So that all has to be compromised and destroyed, and there are certain little metal bars that are inserted through the cervix in stages to dilate the cervix. They're just called dilators. Yeah, okay, so you start with a very thin one and then they go up in thickness, right? Until they get that cervix dilated an inch or more, so that now they go in with the instruments, with the cannula or whatever instrument they're using, yeah, and they have to go in with a curette. Yes, a curette is essentially a scalpel that is very sharp, but it's circular. And so that's to cut up the unborn baby. I think it's actually has a double T. Yeah, these are curettes. They have a very sharp circular loop, like a scalpel, and this is inserted and the baby is cut out. Of course, guided by ultrasound. Dangerous because that abortionist can rupture the uterus and cause a massive hemorrhage. Okay? But then once the embryo or the fetus is chopped up into pieces, then the vacuum is connected and sucked out. And then the nurse has to reassemble that embryo on the desktop, on on a side table to make sure that all the pieces were actually taken out, has to reassemble. Many nurses have converted at that point because they're now seeing they're actually reassembling the human being that was inside. And they said, this is the last time I'm doing this. And they walk out. Because if any piece is left inside, then that's massive hemorrhage, massive infection, and that clinic will get sued again for malpractice. Moving forward into the pregnancy, into the second trimester and third trimester, at some point, that's the skeleton of the baby is too hard, has already calcified, ossified, and a curette will not cut through it, and therefore they have to do either a DNE or a DNX. A DNE is a dilation and evacuation, intact evacuation, where they dilate the cervix even further and take out the whole fetus, all right? But keep in mind, this is the risky part where that fetus could be born alive, and certainly the abortionist and the clinic don't want to do that, right? And so many times what they do is first they insert a needle right into the heart of the fetus and give a massive dosage of potassium chloride and essentially cause a heart attack on the fetus so that make sure that the fetus is dead before they take him or her out, all right? And so that's dilation and evacuation, and intact extraction is when they actually take out the fetus as a whole. They could also try to induce miscarriage by chemical processes to cause, to trigger a miscarriage, but induced into the mother. It's pretty strong and violent on the woman's body because they are actually inducing premature labor, they're inducing premature contractions in the second trimester. It could be 4, 5, 6 months pregnant and inducing these premature contractions. The most extreme type of abortion is known as partial birth abortion. It's a type of DNX, right, where the intact fetus is, again, extracted. But this is up until the 9th month, and that's why I say this is legal. This is, Congress has tried to ban this several times because it is absolutely gruesome, and yet some radicals have to this day prevented, and it's in the courts, it's held up in the courts because since abortion itself is legal, and it's legal until the head of the baby actually comes out of the mother to declare the prosopon a legal person, right? How ironic that the head has to be out so that they can actually see the face, the countenance literally, and declare, oh yes, oh look at this, a human person, right? Legally, I find that so two-faced, really so hypocritical, but at any rate, partial birth abortion is legal. And very, very briefly, this is a diagram that illustrates what happens. The first thing that happens is that the fetus has to be turned to the breech position. Breech is upside down, feet first. Normally, it's the head first, right? The head has to crown through the woman's body, through the pelvis. But no, they go in there with forceps and they turn the fetus around so that it's feet first, all right? And then the abortionist will continue to pull on the body of the fetus partially, but leave the head inside. And now once the neck is right up to the cervix, okay, but still keeping the head inside, so we still don't have a legal person, even though the body of the fetus is outside. Now the abortionist will reach in and will do two things. First, with a pair of scissors, he will sever the spinal cord. He will sever the spinal cord, essentially partially decapitate the fetus, and cutting off the brain from the spinal cord, all right? That kills the fetus. And then the second thing they do is they go in with a vacuum and suck out the brain so that the cranium collapses. And now it's easy to take out that cadaver because now the cranium has collapsed and it's much smaller and will fit through the cervix, the opening. That's partial birth abortion, described in its total crudeness and is barbaric, and it is legal in this country to this day. Okay. So that's part of the biology, the medical part, the clinical part that's involved. Let's talk a little bit about the legalization. Well, let me stop for a moment and see if there are any questions here or comments. It's a tough one, but these are the facts. These are biological facts, and we need to know them. So keep in mind that here, and this is the truth, until the head is literally out of the mother's body, we don't have a legal person. But the minute that head is out, now we have a legal person with full protection under the law, beginning with the right to life. Okay? Totally incongruent, and here it is. We're supposed to be one of the most civilized nations in the world. All right, so let's go back then, if there are no questions or comments, and let's look at the legalization of abortion back in 1973. That was the infamous decision of the Supreme Court, like I say, in overreaching, because they, in fact, legislated by giving this, decree, all right? They legislated because they made abortion legal throughout the 50 states. The case was known as Roe versus Wade. Of course, you know that these are fictitious names to protect the individuals. And, but it is now known, out of her own admission, that Roe was a lady called Norma Mccorvey, and Wade was the state of Texas. And so Norma McCorvey was a young woman back then in the state of Texas who was pregnant. And this was her third pregnancy. And she was young, unmarried. She was, she had had so many men. She was kind of low income, not too educated. In other words, she was the perfect target for a group of radical feminists to use her, some lawyers to use her to push the case for the legalization of abortion. Now, abortion was legal in 1973 in some states. It was up to each state. It was legal in New York. All right, it was illegal in Texas. She happened to be living in Texas. She could have gone to New York and got her abortion. But no, these radical feminists pushed it in the state of Texas to make the case because they knew that this would be appealed. And so they exhausted all the appeals, and this cost nice beaucoup money, pre-money that these radical feminist lawyers poured into the case to take it all the way up to the Supreme Court, because it went from court to court, from local court to district court to regional, etc., until all the appeals were exhausted, and they are exhausted at the Supreme Court. Follow? And so they designed this court, they crafted this case very, very well designed to hit the Supreme Court in 1973, when we had a split court, which was mostly on the liberal side. And so the court was split, and the majority was Justice Blackburn at the time, who gave the verdict in favor of the legalization of abortion. Okay, and so that's when it became legal. Since then, of course, from that point forward, abortion started skyrocketing because before this, it was illegal. So there were these back alley abortions and all that going on. But there were, at the end of the day, very few abortions compared to what happened after 73, about 1.5 million on average a year. It's about one every 22nd throughout the United States when we start counting them day in and day out. All right, and that's how we come up with the 60 million, or about 62 million actually today. Now, Norma Mccorvey. Like I say, she was essentially manipulated, but she became very pro-choice, very pro-choice. And she started going to abortion clinics. She started attending rallies and essentially moving the pro-choice cause big time throughout the whole United States, okay? And she would go and hold women's hands during abortions and be advocate and so forth, because of course women are scared when you go into those clinics. And she was a big, big advocate. In fact, her third pregnancy, she ended up not having the abortion. It was granted during her pregnancy, Roe v. Wade, she won the case, but she ended up having her baby. Okay, she ended up having her third baby. She did not have an abortion, even though it was legal. But then one day, all of a sudden, she's sitting in a clinic. Internet connection unstable. That's interesting. Okay, so she's sitting in an abortion clinic, helping out and getting women prepped up and ready and all that. And she's looking at a poster of embryonic development. Okay, maybe something like that. She's looking at a poster of embryonic development. And this is her testimony. You can Google it in her own words. I was sitting in an OR's operation room office of an abortion clinic when I noticed a fetal development poster right there on the wall. The progression was so obvious. The eyes were so sweet. It hurt my heart just looking at them. I ran outside, and finally, it dawned on me. Norma, I said to myself, they're right. I had worked with pregnant women for years. I had been through 3 pregnancies and deliveries myself. I should have known. Yet something in that poster made me lose my breath. I kept thinking, seeing the picture of the tiny 10-week-old embryo, all right? I said to myself, that's a baby. It's as if blinders just fell off my eyes and I suddenly understood the truth. That's a baby. I felt crushed under the truth of this realization. This is a woman that legalized abortion in the United States, okay? I had to face up to the awful reality. Abortion wasn't about products of conception. It wasn't about missed periods. It was about children being killed in their mother's wombs. All those years, I was wrong. Signing that affidavit, the court affidavit, I was wrong. Working in an abortion clinic, I was wrong. No more of this first trimester, second trimester, third trimester stuff. Abortion at any point was wrong. It was clear, painfully clear. Her testimony, unbelievable. Talk about conversions. Well, it hit like a bombshell, right? Because the pro-choice people went berserk, ballistic. Now this woman, who was a poster child for abortion and women's liberation in the United States and throughout the world, because of course everybody else copies what we do, right? Many countries of the world legalized abortion right after Roe versus Wade, because they say, oh, the United States does this, the Supreme Court, this must be right, okay? So anyway, to this day, you see the riots going on in Poland, right? Riots in Poland because they have a strict abortion ban. And people are rioting for days. Okay, so we have her testimony. She becomes pro-life. And she spends the rest of her life going from rally to rally, pro-life rallies, okay, stating her testimony and asking forgiveness for the big error mistake that she did, because she was essentially manipulated and she thought it was the right thing. Yes, this was the liberation of women so they can have all the sex they want without the consequences. See? So this is her testimony. And I think it's very powerful. She died recently, but she was amazing in her honesty, just totally Amazing. After a short time of being pro-life, actually, she also converted to Catholicism. And the priest who was in charge of guiding her through the process, heard her confession and everything else, was able to reconcile her and put her in a state of grace with the Lord. So another one is Bernard Nathanson. I don't know if you've heard that name, but as I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, this was a big name, Bernard Nathanson. Nathanson was an MD, and at that time, was the largest abortion provider in the United States. Okay? Now, Bernard Nathanson had about 3,000 clinics. No, the 3,000 is the number of abortions that he had done. I don't know how many clinics. He had clinics all over the United States, hundreds of abortion clinics. He himself said one time, when I did my 3,000th abortion, I stopped counting. Okay? The man was just, that's all he did, day and night. All right? Obviously, very lucrative. And then one time he was looking at a sonogram when he was doing a late-term abortion, and he noticed that the fetus was actually running away from his curette. He was trying to catch the fetus and chop him up, and the fetus kept running away. And finally, inside the womb, when he was finally able to nail that fetus down and cut him up, the fetus went like this. That little video became the silent scream. And when Nathanson saw that, he just realized, I just killed a human being. This kid just screamed at me. Couldn't hear it. And that's why it's called silent scream, okay? It's a video, it's out there, you can see it, it's only a few minutes. And silent scream became famous, viral, all right? And so, silent scream now, it turns out that Nathanson also converts to pro-life. And I went to one of his talks back in the 80s, and he went all over the US giving talks and all over the world against abortion. Okay, obviously he shut down all his clinics, asked forgiveness and all that. He also converted. He used to be Jewish, converted to Catholicism. I remember one of the talks he gave, he says, I'm getting invitations to give talks 10 years from now because my calendar is so full, pro-life talks. He says, folks, I don't want to be talking about abortion 10 years from now. You know, we got to get this done today, right? So that's another famous, these are two big ones that I know of anyway, that sooner or later realized the truth, faced the truth, and in great humility accepted the reality of the truth. So at the end of the day, what do we have as an alternative? Well, if killing the unborn is not an alternative, then that unborn has to be born. But it doesn't mean that the woman has to keep the unborn, the baby, okay? So the typical excuse, I mean, now they don't even have an excuse. They don't even give a reason. They don't have to give a reason. The pregnant women to get an abortion, they don't have to give a reason. But the typical reason, of course, what is it gonna be? Well, it's an unwanted pregnancy. In other words, it's a surprise pregnancy. They didn't want that child, they didn't want the pregnancy. Very few really think that they don't associate it with the intercourse, okay? They know that there's a risk of getting intercourse, but there's been a number of studies and surveys done, like on teenagers, for example, and pregnant teenagers, right? And they asked the pregnant, well, didn't you know that you can get pregnant by having intercourse? And he says, oh yeah, I know that, but why would it happen to me? You know, I didn't know that it could happen to me. So you see the disconnect, and the disconnect with all humility is because they really don't have a full brain, right? The brain takes two dozen years to really mature. And so teenagers, by definition, they generally, statistically don't have a full brain, and so they make these rash decisions, and they bring on a second wave of COVID because they go party and so forth, and they think they're invincible, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I'm simplifying the issue, but the point is that a woman who seeks an abortion, a procured abortion, is because it's an unplanned pregnancy, it's an unwanted pregnancy. Oh, I should put the third list here, of course, the more recent one, who was working for Planned Parenthood, the one who wrote the book on plants. Okay, the name will come to me. Let's do it right now. She was in March yesterday. It's her book. Yeah, now it's a movie. It's a very good movie then. Abby Johnson. Abby Johnson, thank you. Planned Parenthood clinic supervisor. She was one of the top. She was the youngest clinic supervisor and had a huge, what do you call that? Success rate and chance to grow in the company, in the industry of abortion with Planned Parenthood, because she was setting quotas of abortions and driving her staff to get more and more abortions. She was making galore money for Planned Parenthood and had very high prospects of becoming a very successful executive in Planned Parenthood at the highest levels, being so young. And she was asked one time that a nurse didn't show up. She was asked to assist an abortion inside because she had never been inside the actual OR operating room. And when she saw what happened and the sucking up of the baby parts into the vacuum and the jar, she basically freaked out, broke down, and had her conversion there. And now she's pro-life, and she has converted and wrote the book first, Unplanned, and then the film. Giving her testimony, all right? Powerful, very powerful. And so the Planned Parenthood threatened her. Says, you are going up against the largest abortion provider in the world, okay? And so from now on, watch your back. They threatened her, straight up. Oh, she gave her testimony just yesterday again at the pro-life march in Washington, D.C. Anyway, so this is what we have. So the fact that the woman gives birth doesn't mean that she has to keep that child, right? I find it very, very courageous, heroic for a pregnant mom who has an unplanned pregnancy, who has the courage to carry the pregnancy to term and then give the child for adoption. Give the child for adoption, okay? And don't kill her child. You know that there are, on the other side, on the counter side of things, there are thousands and thousands of couples in the United States who, for one reason or another, which we'll see in further lectures, cannot have children. They cannot have children. And they're desperate to adopt a child. And you know that babies are not to be found in the United States for adoption. They're not to be found. They have to go outside. They have to go to Russia. They have to go to Eastern Europe. They go to Eastern Europe because it's relatively easy to adopt there, and they're white babies, you know, they're Caucasian babies, or they go to Latin America to adopt because there are no babies to be found for adoption in the United States because they don't make it to term, right? All the babies that are born and wanted, the unwanted didn't make it. And so really, I find it very, very courageous, and I think we should always consider to help a woman who is pregnant and doesn't want that pregnancy, to help her, to give her all the assistance she needs, including the medical, the psychological, the spiritual, the financial support that she needs so that she doesn't kill that child and then later, some time later, regret it for the rest of her life, you know, but rather just have the baby and get the baby up for adoption because there are all these couples that are dying to adopt these babies, okay? The family, of course, and the friends are very instrumental there over the years and the decades. I've had many people approach me and tell me, well, my friend and my family member is pregnant, she doesn't want the kid, what do we do? So we put out all the resources that are available for her, okay? And so you people are instrumental because you're out there and you hear about the young people, what's going on. So this is a number of resources that are available with the phone numbers. Heartbeat of Miami and Respect Life Ministry, all of these, they do counseling, they do sidewalk counseling, they also do, they have centers, they have clinics where they do ultrasound for the moms for free. They give them the baby clothes and the formula and the food, everything that's needed for the mom, for her to give birth to the child, okay? Heartbeat is Protestant, Respect Life is Catholic, but we're all focused on the same ministry, so those are the numbers there. Then for Florida and for every state, there is typically a Department of Children and Families, DCF, and they also give they give the support for the mom, financial and medical, including the other children and herself, because I know for a fact, in fact, I have a cousin of mine who works in DCF. She's one of the managers, supervisors in the southern region, all the way down into the Florida Keys. And she tells me, oh yes, we give full support for the mom who is pregnant throughout her pregnancy and after birth, all the medical support that she needs for free by the state. And also if she has other children, they also get medical support for free, already born, and the mom also, okay? So we paid for this already through our taxes. It's part of the State of Florida Department of Children and Families. So that's available. And then there's also at the national level, there is a WIC, a Women, Infants, and Children, which is at the federal level. For example, sometimes you go to the supermarket and you go to the produce area and you see WIC. Have you ever seen WIC fruit, WIC apple? And WIC, yeah, they're produce which are healthy. These are healthy for the mother and for pregnant moms and for children so that they don't become child diabetes. You know, children diabetes, we have a problem with junk food in kids and soda and all this. And now we have this epidemic childhood diabetes in the United States, overweight, childhood obesity, right? And so WIC food is supposed to be good and healthy for women, infants, and children. It's in the supermarkets. These are two other projects that are for healing after the abortion, because we don't abandon people ever. We should never abandon them, even after abortion. Perhaps they need more help than ever because they are crushed. Because sooner or later, they're gonna run into the poster. They're gonna run into the reality and the truth that they have killed their child, okay? And so they're gonna need help in that healing process. And these are ministries that we have. Project Rachel is for helping women who have had abortion come to terms with themselves, come to reconcile, ask forgiveness of God, of themselves, and of their unborn child. So that's a project that has been going on for years at the national level. And more recently, well, about 3 or 4 years ago, it was started here in the Archdiocese of Miami by a brother, a friar, a Franciscan friar friend of mine. He started Project Joseph, okay? Because this friar, who is a widower with, I forget how many children he had, he's got grandchildren also, and he's a psychiatrist by profession, retired now, and became a monk, became a Franciscan monk. And so he has a community in Broward near St. Maximilian Colby Parish. And so he would do street counseling, sidewalk counseling. And he noticed that many times the abortion clinics are in shopping centers. We have one in Hialeah, for example, that's right in front of Hialeah High School. They typically place themselves near high schools, public high schools, in shopping centers, right? And so there was a little strip mall shopping center of an abortion clinic. The one in Hialeah, for example, in front of the high school, has a daycare center next to it. I mean, it's just gruesome. We've been there before. But anyway, this one shopping center, I think it was in Broward, had a convenience store next to it, you know, like a 7-Eleven or something like that. And so sometimes the boyfriends who brought their girls to the clinic, they would hang out because the procedure is several hours. And of course, after the abortion, the woman cannot drive, right? Because she's cramped and crunched over and destroyed. And so she has to be driven home. And so sometimes the boyfriends hang out in at the convenience store, and they're just hanging around there. They're talking with each other, maybe smoking a cigarette or having a soda or a beer, whatever. And so Brother Jay, before he became a monk, he would go and talk to them. He would go to the convenience store and start talking to them. You know, so he was counseling, being a psychiatrist, to these men who are the boyfriends or the husbands who brought their women to the clinic, right? And since the procedure takes several hours, he had ample time there to do some counseling. And lo and behold, a number of these guys got interested in the conversation, in the dialogue, and they started realizing that this is killing their child too, because it's outside of them, but it's still their child because it was their sperm that fertilized that egg, and that's their child too. Okay, in fact, we have witnessed this also at the abortion clinic over there, that sometimes the woman wants the abortion and the guy doesn't want the abortion. Whether it's the husband or the boyfriend doesn't want the abortion. They want their child, and they have zero options. They have no options because that child, since the child, the unborn is not a legal person, but exists materially, nobody denies that there's something in there, right? Then it's a thing. It's a thing, and it's a possession of the woman, especially because of the placenta. The placenta is attached to the woman and it's sucking nutrients from the woman, and therefore this thing belongs to me, the pregnant woman, all right? And I can do with this thing as I wish. And if I want to get rid of this parasite, then I get rid of the parasite. And so the husband or the boyfriend or the father of that child has zero options legally, okay? Sometimes they're waiting there, but they don't want the abortion to go on. Anyway, it's a very mixed bag of people, as you know, you can imagine. He actually convinced, Brother Jay actually convinced some of these guys to walk in and try to convince their women to leave the clinic. You know, perhaps they have brought the girlfriend to the clinic, but now after the talk, they realize it is their child too, and they now realize that they have all of this support available, and they can keep the child, or they can give they can give the child to an adoption, etc. But now they have options, which they didn't know these options before. They were just scared. And so some men have gone back in and gotten the women out, or tried to get them out in the reception, because they'll be waiting there in the reception, sitting down, these women. Typically it's very quiet and very silent. Everybody's looking down or their phone. Anyway, he started this ministry, and now it's a full-fledged program that has many steps involved in it and so forth. And it's called Project Joseph, of course, named after Joseph, the husband of Mary and the foster father of Jesus, okay? Who had to accept a very difficult pregnancy because he knew two things. Joseph knew two things about Mary's pregnancy. He knew two things. He knew that Mary was pregnant, and he knew that he didn't do it. And he had to accept that as God's plan and God's will, all right? So Joseph was a very courageous guy. Anyway, that's Project Joseph. And we're proud in the Archdiocese of Miami. Started here several years ago, like I say, Brother Jay. And now it's nationwide. It's gone nationwide. The project, many bishops have adopted this project in their own diocese, and it's flourishing, and it's to try to get these guys to heal. And it has a follow-up component after the abortion, okay? He always gives them the little handout, little paper with his phone number and so forth. And some guys do call back, and when they have remorse or when they want to talk about it, etc. And so these are positive stuff about the whole scenario of abortion, okay? I always put my cell phone out there. I forgot to print this, but I'll bring it next time, and you have it on the slide. For the undergrads, when I teach this part, I always print this out and give them this as a handout, which I neglected to do today, but you do have recourse to it here, all right? So it's handy to keep this little handout the back of your pocket, because you never know when you run into someone that may need it, and you may actually be instrumenting in saving a life. Okay, like we have witnessed in one abortion clinic actually closed down next to Immaculate Conception Parish in Hialeah. You could hear the bells. It was 3 blocks away from the parish, for heaven's sakes. You could hear the bells of the church inside the clinic. It was just unbelievable. Thank God they closed down. Now it's a dermatologist. Okay, that's it. Questions, comments? I know I've dished out a lot in a short while again. But you see how we do the bioethics? We build up the case biologically first, and clinically, medically, and then we do the ethical analysis. All based on the fact that the unborn is also a human being, like you and I are human beings. Okay, well, I think I'm basically preaching to the choir here. In the sense that we are pro-life, we have it in our hearts, in our minds. And to me, always the challenge is not preaching to the choir, but remember, you're supposed to become experts in the field here of bioethics, so how to convince others, right? How to convince others. Over the decades, I've always found it very, very challenging and difficult to have a rational, reasonable argument, dialogue with pro-choice, with pro-abortionists. They just won't have it. It becomes passionate. Oh no, the first thing they tell me, oh, how many children did you molest today, priest? That's how the argument starts, okay? How many children did you molest today? Please, for heaven's sakes. You know, we can at least be respectful, right? But no, it's very, very challenging, very difficult because of course it becomes emotional, right? Okay, well, thank you once again for your attention to this. Of course, it's a bombshell of a topic to this day, decades and decades earlier. Not even to mention the change in administration. The first thing he does precisely on the March for Life on January 22nd. I don't even know if I put the date there. Yeah, this was January 22nd. So every year, the week of January 22nd, there's a March for Life in Washington, D.C. It's the most gruesome time of the year to be in Washington. There's snow and sleet and frozen rain and blizzards. I've been to the March for Life several times. We've gotten caught in blizzards. You see not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people march for life. You never see it in the news, of course, secular news. Well, what does the new administration does? It actually reverses the Mexico City policy, which Mexico City basically was a forum that was done to ban using United States funds for funding abortions in other parts of the world. In other words, banning the use of our taxes to fund abortion and to promote abortion in other parts of the world. That is the pro-life stand, and that was signed in Mexico City. Well, the first thing that this new president did was he reverted that by executive office. He reversed the protocol of Mexico City Protocol. So now our taxes will again go to pay for abortions in other parts of the world and to promote abortion through Planned Parenthood International. Very sad, very real. 2 administrations ago, when we also had President Obama, the first thing he did on January 22nd, 23rd, right at the march, as the march was going on, he signed the legalization of embryonic stem cell research, right? In other words, the release of federal funds for human embryonic stem cell research. So, I mean, it's like they do it on purpose. The week of the pro-life march, they do the pro-abortion thing, okay? Because they have the power. God help us, Lord have mercy, but this is the political reality that we're living in today. Today, almost 50 years, 48 years after Roe v. Wade. Okay, folks, thank you once again. I'm going to stop here now, and God willing, we'll start again next week, okay? Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye now. Thank you.